Welcome back everyone. Today we're going to be color blocking. And now I'm going to be using the oversized crew neck pattern I used in the previous video. I designed this pattern as an easy introduction into color blocking. It's split up into sections so you can easily just pick your colors and start sewing. And by doing this, it'll give you an idea on how to do this to any other pattern. And hopefully with the tips and techniques I show you throughout the video, it's going to take your sewing and color blocking to the next level. And with all that being said, grab the download and let's get started. Getting started with supplies, you're going to want to grab 3 to 3.5 yards of sweatshirt fleece or fleece, and I recommend picking at least 4 colors. And a really good tool to help you pick these colors is the Dictionary of Color Combinations, and it pretty much just shows a bunch of different color combinations. This can be really helpful if you're a visual designer. A 1/4 yard of ribbing for the cuffs, waistband, and neckline. And lastly, your pattern. The pattern is available at properfitclothing.com, and the link will be provided in the description below. And this pattern can be made in multiple variations. You can do a standard crew neck or turtleneck, one with a pocket, and color blocked. Once you printed the pattern, it's best to cut the top edge and the side edge of all the pages. This will allow you to overlap the pattern from left to right in alphanumerical order. Once you have the pages all lined up, tape it together and cut out the size that works best for you. And this is just a quick reference to what your pattern should look like after taping it together. And since this is an oversized pattern, it's best to use the measurement chart to find the size that you're looking to make. Once you determine the size, we're going to go ahead and get the pattern ready for color blocking. Cut the guidelines on the front panel, back panel, and sleeve panel. And instead of cutting on the fold, we're going to actually use these sections to cut out our fabric. Each of these sections will be a separate color. And that's why it's best to pick at least 4 colors so you have a variety to choose from. After cutting, you should end up with 2 sleeves, and that will be 1 color for each of the sections. 1 front body panel, and this is also split up into sections, and you're going to want 2 per section. And as you can see, we're just dividing the pattern up instead of placing it on the fold. And same goes for the back panel, 2 for each of the section. And you would apply the same technique to any pattern. Just split the pattern up into equal sections and give a different color for each of the section. And you can cut the pocket in half and do 2 colors, or you can do 1 color. And before we get started, for this project, we're going to be using a serger. Sergers are great for stretchy knit fabrics. They're going to allow the fabric to stretch and the thread not to break. They also cut and clean up the edges as you're sewing. I highly recommend using a serger for this project, but if you don't have one, it's totally fine. I'm going to show you another method for sewing stretchy knit on your domestic sewing machine. Switch your machine to a zigzag stitch with the higher width and stitch length. And by doing this, it will allow the thread to stretch with the fabric. And either method works great. I just don't want you to feel left out if you don't have a serger. Getting started with construction, grab the front and back top panels, and we're going to place the right sides together for both of the fronts and the right sides together for both of the back and stitch along the vertical axis. And this will be the seam that falls directly in the center of the sweater. And if you don't have a serger, just go ahead and do a zigzag stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Flip the right sides up and we're going to add a top stitch. And you can put the seam allowance to the left or the right. We're going to be using a presser foot that has an edge guide on it. This will help you get an even stitch around those edges. But if you don't have this presser foot, it's not a big deal. Just take your time, go slow, and make sure that the stitches are nice and straight. You want this one to be as neat as possible because it's going to be the center of the front and the back. Grab the center sections of both your front and back panel, place the right sides together, and stitch the vertical edge. Again, this is going to be the inside edge. And if you don't have a serger, stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Flip the seam allowance to the left or the right and add a top stitch to both of the sections. And matching the thread with the fabric really helps hide any minor mistakes. Grab the bottom section for both the front and the back panel, and we're going to repeat the same process. Flip the right sides together and sew along the vertical edge. And when you have both sections sewn, go ahead and add your top stitches. And it's best to flip the seam allowance the same way throughout the front and the back panel. So if you flipped it to the left, do left for all 3 sections. Grab your sleeve panels, and we're going to do 1 sleeve at a time. Using the middle section as a base, flip the right sides together and stitch both the top and the bottom edge of that middle section. And it's best to have your sleeve laid out flat as if it were just one piece. It helps keep everything in order, and so that way you don't sew the wrong sides together. Point the seam allowances towards the outside edges and add a top stitch to both of those seams. You can flip the seam allowances any way you want. I just like flipping them towards the outside edge, then it gives a band effect to the middle section. And go ahead and repeat the same process for the other sleeve. Grab your pocket panel and place the right side up, and we're going to add a stitch to both the diagonal edges. And this is going to be a serge. You can also do a zigzag stitch if you don't have a serger. Roll the edges over about a 1/4 inch, and we're going to add a hem to both of those diagonal edges. This is going to be the pocket opening, and it's best to pin it down after you rolled it over so that way it stays secure down as you're sewing. And I did 2 stitches. You can either do 2 or 1 stitch. Grab your middle section, place the right side up, and grab your pocket, place the right side up, line up the centers of the middle section and your pocket, grab your top section, and place the right sides together, lining up that center and the top edge. And when everything is lined up, stitch along that top edge. And I feel it's best to have that center pinned as you're sewing so that way everything stays centered when you're sewing it together. Grab the bottom section of your front panel, place it on the bottom edge with right sides together. And go ahead and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And having these panels lined up is very crucial because it's the front of your sweatshirt, so it's very noticeable. We're going to do the same with this one. Flip the seam allowance towards the outside edges and add your top stitch. And I strongly recommend using thread that matches your fabric. It's going to make for an overall more professional look. Another alternative than using a straight stitch is using a cover stitch machine. And for that top edge, what I like to do is stop at the center, switch the thread out for the other color, and keep stitching. And that's going to complete the assembly of your front panel, and we're going to go ahead and do the same thing for the back panel. Place the right sides together for the top section and the middle section and also the bottom section. After sewing the sections together, add your top stitch. Moving on, grab both your front and your back completed panels, place the right sides together, and sew along the shoulder seams. Flip the right side up and we're going to add a top stitch by folding the seam allowance towards the back panel. Switch to the color thread and do the same thing for the other shoulder seam. And after top stitching, lay the garment out flat with the right sides pointing up. Grab your sleeves and mark the center of the sleeve and line the center of the sleeve up with the shoulder seam. And repeat this process with the other sleeve. And once the sleeves are lined up, stitch along those edges at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I think it's best to slightly pull both of the layers towards your body as you're sewing, so that way the fabric lays straight and it's easier to get a nice straight stitch on that curved edge. But it's best just to take it slow, and once you're done, we're going to add a top stitch to that edge, point the seam allowance towards both of the body panels, and add your stitch. After top stitching, flip the right sides together, lining up the arms and the body, and we're going to stitch the side seams. And this is the part you really want to take your time and make sure that all the sections are lined up so it looks nice and smooth, going from the front to the back panel. I like to start at the bottom of the front and back panel and work my way up towards the sleeve. And I like to go section by section, making sure they're lined up as I'm going. After sewing, check your seams and then flip the right side out. And you can add a top stitch to the side seam, but it's totally up to you. Grab your neckline, waistband, and cuff panels. Starting with the neckline turtleneck panel, place the right sides together and stitch both of the side edges. And keep sewing directly through that middle. You can stop with the needle down, turn the fabric, and keep sewing straight. Moving on to the waistband panels, place the right sides together and sew both of the side edges at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And working with ribbing, I think it's best to use a straight stitch. Lastly, our sleeve cuffs. Fold them in half with the right sides together and sew along the outside edge. And then we're going to take each one, fold it in half with the wrong sides touching so it forms a nice round clean top edge. And these can easily be adjusted for more or less cinch by adding more or less fabric, and also by height by adding more or less height. And this is for whatever look you're going for. And to attach them, flip it inside out, and we're going to start with the waistband panel. Place it on the inside of the bottom edge with the rolled side facing towards the neckline. And as you can see, it's smaller than the actual width, and this is because you stretch it and it pulls it back towards itself to cinch at the bottom. So just take it slow and remember to pull that ribbing panel towards you. Since the ribbing is actually shorter than the width of all the openings, you have to pull it so that way you match the width. Do the same thing with the cuff panels. Place the rolled side up towards the shoulder seam and sew around that entire cuff edge. And lastly, the neckline panel. And the seam on the neckline panel, I like to line up with the shoulder seam. It gives her a more smooth transition when going from shoulder seam to neckline. And for the final step, we're going to add a top stitch to all of the openings. Starting with the waistband, fold the seam allowance up towards the body panel and stitch all the way around the outside edge. And for the bottom, since it's stretched a lot, we're going to do 2 separate stitches for the front and the back. So once you get halfway around, stop and start a new stitch. And this is going to allow for the bottom edge to stretch without snapping the thread. And for both of the sleeves, move the seam allowance up towards the shoulder seam and stitch around the outside edge. And it's best to do this on a post-bed sewing machine. Most sewing machines, you can pop out that bed and it's easy to sew around the sleeve. And lastly, our neckline. Point the seam allowance down towards the body and stitch all the way around. I like to stop halfway and start a new stitch with the opposite color. And I know I said it before, but the neckline, you really want to take your time with this top stitch because it's right in front and it's really easy to see. And after that stitch, that's going to complete your sweatshirt. And there you have it, your color block crew neck is complete. Thank you so much for watching and supporting the channel. I'm gonna do my best to keep videos coming at you weekly. And if you ever have any other questions about the sewing or anything you want me to make, definitely send it my way in a comment or on the website, and I'll for sure get back to you. But until then, I'm gonna keep the videos coming at you, so I'll see you next time.